Welcome to Pockets of Joy, Season 2, Episode 6. Today I'm joined by the esteemed Dr. Anthony Delaney, a historian and writer specialising in queer history. His book Queer Georgians comes out next year with Penguin. Dive into this pocket of joy as we discuss some interesting queer and trans history, Ireland's same-sex marriage referendum, gender identity, trans rights, and so much more. You can catch the video version on YouTube. Check the show notes for all the links we mention. Enjoy. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm doing an Edwardian look for our talk.
I can see, I feel very underdressed now.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed now. You could have made more of an effort.
I was writing this morning, that's my excuse. I was trying to write, my bloody computer was acting up, but anyway.
No, that's fine. I just take any excuse to get into costume, so I'm just going for it.
Good, I'm glad one of us is making the effort.
So what are you writing at the moment? What are you working on?
So I'm doing the first draft. Well, I think this might be also the final draft of edits on my first book, which is Queer Georgians, and that comes out next year. And yeah, it's kind of the culmination. Well, it's kind of the strange offspring of my PhD, I suppose. And it's not for an academic audience, so it's what we call a trade publication, and it's coming out with Penguin in the UK and Ireland and all over Europe, and then with Grove Atlantic in the US. So it's a really exciting time, but there is work to be done nonetheless. And do you know what though? I'm loving it. I'm absolutely loving it. You know, you often hear writers go, "Oh, you know, it's burning into my soul and it's costing me so much of myself, and it's draining me of everything I have." I'm like, this is really energizing for me. I feel creatively fulfilled. It's great. So I'm enjoying the process.
That's brilliant. And what is it about the Georgian period that made you want to tell their story? Is it that there's more like info available than going further back in queer history?
Well, my master's in history was, which I did a long time. I did my master's before I went to drama school, but the master's I did when I was 19, and I did early modern history. So that would be, people usually say that's 1485 up to about, this is up for debate, but let's say the 1710s. Now, the reason I didn't do that for my PhD is because it requires too much Latin and classical world knowledge and all that kind of thing. And I was a bit like, I just want to have fun with this. And the Georgian period is equally difficult and fun. I mean, you have to remember that like the Georgian period is also the time period during which the transatlantic slave trade is really taking hold. So that's shaping the world, and that's this diabolical backdrop to what's going on. But in terms of queerness, one of the reasons that I was drawn to it specifically was because they're asking a lot of the same questions that we're asking in our own time about gender, sex, sexuality. But the brilliant thing about the Georgians, unlike the Victorians who come after them, is that they don't necessarily demand answers. They're far more interested in the questions than they are in the answers. So it was a combination of those two things that brought me to the Georgian period, or the long 18th century, as it's also called.
That's what I was just going to ask. Could you define the Georgian period for anyone listening who doesn't know offhand, like myself? What years are spanning?
Yeah, and the Georgian period is far less famous than, say, the Tudor period or the Victorian period, because you think Tudors, you think Henry VIII, you think Victorian era, obviously, then you have Victoria. So the Georgian period runs from 1714 to 1837, that the Hanoverians are sitting on the throne. So like Queen Charlotte in Bridgerton, that's Georgian.
Mm-hmm. And are you looking at UK specific history? Because I know you're Irish, but living in the UK at the moment. Or are you also taking into account, are there many historical resources available to you from Irish queer history of that period?
Yeah, there's some really interesting queer Irish Georgians from that time, two of whom are in the book, and they are Kilkenny women. People might know them better as the Ladies of Llangollen. I'm from Kilkenny originally myself, so that's why it meant a lot to me to have that history in there. Now, the ladies become very famous in the first decades of the 19th century, specifically when they set up home together in Wales, in Llangollen. And that's where people know them. They're visited by world-renowned politicians. The people on the throne are talking about them, and Lister goes to visit them because they're so inspiring. But behind that, and I think it's really important for us as Irish people not to forget this, and particularly for queer Irish people, they are Kilkenny women, they're from Ireland, and that's our history too. And so we have to share in that, and we have to own it. And then there's another incredible man called Dr. James Barry. And James Barry was born to a different name and gender in Cork, and then eventually moved to London and then around the world. And he was the first person to ever perform a successful cesarean section in South Africa. So, you know, these are incredible, accomplished people from Ireland who have a queer past, and I think it's really important for us to know, because often it's like we think these things don't start until Oscar Wilde, and often if I'm, you know, giving interviews or giving talks or whatever, people will go, "So talk to me about Oscar Wilde." I'm like, well, you can Google Oscar Wilde. He's there, like you'll find him, and I love his history. It's really interesting, but what comes before is more interesting, because I think we need a deeper understanding of those historical roots. And by the way, the Georgian period is not the beginning of this. It's just an unexplored part. So I'm hoping that by pushing the research back into the Georgian era, that other people then take up the baton and push it back even further as much as they can.
I love that. I think that's fascinating. What's always put me off about history, I remember doing it in school up to junior cert in the 90s. So I would have done my junior cert, and it was the intercert for some of my subjects, even then in music. But what put me off was it was all men fighting wars and politics and wanting power and money. And I had absolutely no interest in hearing any of that. I still don't to this day. What I'm interested is in the domestic life of people. What were the women up to? What were the gay people up to? What were the trans people up to? I think all the untold stories are where it's at, because that brings it down to a human level, not looking at, you know, political countries against countries. I want to know what was life like for the everyday people. So without like too many spoilers, I'd love to hear more about these three Irish people you've mentioned, the Kilkenny women and Dr. James Barry, Barry James. James Barry.
James Barry, yeah, James. So let's concentrate on James, because he actually isn't in the book, because it's a little bit later than my period. He's born into a Georgian world, but he dies in a Victorian world. So we'll concentrate on him, but it gives a bit of a snapshot of what was possible. Barry's achievements are interesting in themselves. They'd be interesting if this wasn't what we would now term a trans history. But the way Barry's achievements and identity comes into question and comes up for discussion is that when he dies, he is laid out by a charwoman. And a charwoman is somebody who would have come in to clean the fire. She would have done some laundry. And we think she worked for him when he was alive, but charwomen weren't necessarily live-in servants. So she would have just come, she would have got paid, she would have taken away any work she could, and then come back with it the following day or a couple of days later. Anyway, on the side, she also laid out the dead, because that, you know, it's just a supplementary form of income. So when she was laying out Dr. James Barry, she discovered that, or what she thought she discovered, was that Barry had been concealing his true biological sex, and she went to his friend, who was a physician who signed the death warrant and signed him as male, and said, I know the truth as she perceived it, and I'm going to, either you pay me or I'm going to go to the press and expose Barry for what he was, in her understanding. She also said that I also have proof from the body that Barry has at some point carried a child. So where is that child? What happened to that child? And Barry's friend, the doctor, responds by going, you do whatever you feel you need to do. As far as I'm concerned, this is a man, I've known him for X amount of time. I have no interest in this conversation. You go and do whatever you need to do. And she did then go to the press. And his story gets...
Sorry,
Yeah.
can I ask what year was this exactly?
Oh, this is 1860, in the 1860s. Yeah,
Oh,
it's in the
so quite
1860s.
recently, yeah.
Yeah, relatively recently. And so she goes and she sells the story. It becomes this whole big thing, and often, and the kind of repercussions that we're left with. So I was just filming a documentary in Edinburgh recently, and Barry trained at the medical school in Edinburgh. And there is a plaque to him on the wall. And I just happened to be passing by it. And I made a video of this on my socials, and it's on the History Hit socials too. But it says the first woman to have gone through the medical school in Edinburgh. Now, I fully appreciate and understand the troubled feminist history of women not being allowed into those institutions and the ways in which women tried to navigate their exclusion from medical institutions or third level institutions more generally. I absolutely get that. And I think it's a really important history. And many people have written upon it conclusively. But Barry died living his life as a male. And you will often hear people say that Barry only became male because he needed to achieve something. And he wasn't able to achieve that as a woman, i.e., go to medical school. And while there might be some element of something in that, at the same time, Barry dies as a man, conducted his entire life as a man, and left us no clues whatsoever under his own hand or confession to say that he was anything other than a man. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to respect the legacy that he wanted us to have, and that was Dr. James Barry, who was a man. And so I raised this with the university, so it'll be interesting to see where that conversation goes. But you know, these histories, especially trans histories, are so few and far between. And in my view, Barry ends his days as a man. He doesn't make any, you know, huge revelation. Look, actually, I was a woman, and this is how I got into medical school. You can beat the system. There is none of that. He's actually very conservative in many of his approaches to things, and so for me, I think it's important that we respect what he wanted his legacy to be after death. And then we have this intervention where people wouldn't allow him to maintain that legacy. So that becomes a bit of a problem.
Definitely. And the two Kilkenny ladies, without giving any spoilers about your book, what were they doing professionally? Were they ladies of higher society? They must have been to get some attention from the crown. What was their profession, or what was their setup?
So we have Lady Eleanor Butler and Miss Sarah Ponsonby. So by lady, you can tell we're not dealing with the everyday Joe Soap now when we're talking about them. So Lady Eleanor Butlers of the Butlers from Kilkenny. So they are essentially the landed family in Kilkenny from the 13th century, 15th century rather, and they're the elite of the elite in Kilkenny. They are a Catholic family, so that has come in the 18th century with some restrictions around them in the penal laws. So Eleanor spends a lot of time in France as a result, but she's very much a Kilkenny woman. Sarah Ponsonby is an orphan, and she's raised by the Fownes family, who are related to her through her father's family in Istig, which is a beautiful spot. And the house doesn't survive. The ruins of it are there. But they're very strong-willed. They are they're very Irish in elite Irish, but I mean nonetheless Irish for that. And they understand themselves as Irish. So there is no living to be carved out there. They're one of the things that happens is their families agree a stipend that each of them are given throughout the remainder of their lives. So they live on family money for the rest of their lives. But it's certainly, especially for Eleanor, it's certainly a reduction in status in some way, because despite the fact that she's Lady Eleanor Butler, and that title is not bestowed upon her until after her brother restores the titles to the family a few years later in the 19th century, she's living in a cottage. Now, look, when I say cottage, it's not a little one-roomed thing where the cows are sleeping in the corner. It's very much not that. It's relatively large. It's kind of like a manor house, I suppose, but it's certainly not a castle, and it's certainly not a stately home that both of them would have been used to living in before. But the domestic setup that they have intrigues people because they're two women living together. And that's what, and it's seen as a very romantic, although not necessarily sexual setup, because people maybe can't get their heads around that. But certainly, although some can, the romanticism of how they live is what appeals to most people. And by the way, we don't know whether these two particular women ever had sex. We don't know that they didn't, but that's not what's important here. What I preface in all of these things is intimacy, and who people spend the most intimate times of their lives with. And for Sarah and Eleanor, they're buried together still, and they're actually buried with their Irish maid, Mary Carroll, who came with them from Kilkenny, and she spent her life with them in Llangollen as well. So the three of them are all buried together in a graveyard in Wales, and it's quite moving to go and visit them. Particularly, I made the same journey that they did from the coast in Ireland all the way over to Holyhead, and then took the same journey that they, well, obviously I was in a car, not in a coach, but I wasn't going to be that method about it. But yeah, it was nice to follow in their footsteps, because I do feel like we are following in their footsteps, especially as a queer person, from Kilkenny. They are my ancestors to a certain extent, even if they're not my blood kin, they're my queer kin. And also, it's worth kind of noting within the context of this time, there was never a law against women having sex together. That was never prosecuted. It was only men. And so there was a certain freedom, I use that term loosely, that was afforded to queer women within the structure of 18th century society, because it wasn't as odd, for want of a better word, for two women to live together as it was for two men. Although men lived together too, but they had to be a little bit more crafty about that.
Yeah. Even right up to, I used to read Enid Blyton when I was a kid and a teenager. I went to a mixed primary, but then an all-girls Catholic secondary school. And I remember reading books like Mallory Towers and all those boarding school books. It was a very romanticized view, obviously, of a boarding school, because my mom was actually at one in the 60s in Ireland, and it was not at all like the midnight feasts and the bottles of ginger beer that you read about. But there were always talks about girls having pashes or crushes on the older girls in those school books. And it seems to me like we lost that, what would you call that, fluidity of attraction in our general parlance. Maybe from, I don't know, when did we become so polarized into these straight and gay couples? When was it okay, like up to what generation was it okay to go, yeah, I've got a crush on that older girl in school, or that older boy? It seems like that continued into the writing, at least, of Enid Blyton until the 50s or 60s. And it seems like that's fallen out now. And there's so much polarization of gender and of attraction, isn't there? And everything is so heavily categorized.
Yeah, I think a definite point at which things change is 1868. That's the first point at which we have the term homosexual. And homosexual was invented to describe sexual experience rather than a sexual identity, but it very soon became embroiled in all kinds of social, legal, cultural identity markers. And heterosexual, now the term homosexual has changed its meaning, as I say, because that was used to describe a sexual experience rather than identity. Then heterosexual was invented to describe an over committance to the opposite sex. So it was seen as a little bit unusual, a little bit like intense, that if you were described as heterosexual, you were being probably a little bit of a stalker and a little bit too much. So obviously these things change, but what happens in the 19th century is that there's this idea of categorization. The 19th century is famous for this. In Olga, they want to know what the plants are called, they want to know what everything is, and it feeds into this idea of empire, ownership, and dominion, where if you can name something, you can control it. And this is why I rather than using heteronormative in my PhD, I use the term heteroregulated, because normative implies that something has occurred in nature and this is the default position. Whereas heteroregulated shows, which was the case, that actually what happened was that people intervened, classified, and changed rules and changed the law around these ideas of gender and sexuality that were formulated, that were literally made up. Somebody had to write them down. It's not like they just occurred in nature and then people went, oh, now I have a label, I found it under a tree. No, somebody sat down and made up these distinctions. Mm-hmm. And those distinctions in the 19th century negated that fluidity that you're talking about and kind of rid us of that for a while. I think that's coming back in more so now. And it's a very Georgian thing, actually, which is why I often draw parallels between the 18th century and now. But my other caution would be for young people now who are really determined to add labels to things and have that identity marker. And I understand that. I understand the need to belong to a community. However, my warning would be that as soon as those labels go into place, you will start to see regulation come around the labels. And you were seeing it in America, for instance, with the trans community, who now that there's far more of an identity around, not so much far more of an identity, the identity has always been there, far more language around that identity. We're seeing a really strong move to regulate trans identities that have always been there. Nothing has changed. Now what's changing is the ways in which we regulate that, because
Explain
our
that to me.
language is changing.
So can you explain to me, if you're in America and if you're trans, how are people trying to regulate you?
So in a multitude of ways, there have been hundreds of acts passed in the last 2 years alone, literally hundreds, around the idea of gender and sexuality. So say, for instance, we'll do a bit of a spread of these. Certain books are being banned. So for instance, if there are children's books that try to discuss what it might mean to feel like you are not the gender that you were assigned at birth, and those books are told and are communicated in a really child-friendly way. And it's basically about clothing at that point. Like, you feel free to wear whatever clothes you want to wear. Those books are being banned. So that's for a child who's experiencing that, they actively want to discourage them from having any sort of outlet to have that discussion with their parents through fiction, for instance, age appropriate fiction, of course. Then there's more kind of medicalized interventions where life-saving treatment in a lot of cases is not available to trans people in America because the individual states have intervened. Well, I'm sure you've heard about a lot of the discussions around what spaces trans people are allowed into, specifically trans women, which also feeds into this misogynistic idea, because you never hear the same discussions happening about trans men. That's never discussed in the same way. So it is, and these spaces are now legislated and regulated to exclude trans women, when trans women have been in these spaces for decades and indeed centuries. Nothing has changed. There is no new threat. The only new threat is to trans people in the legislative acts that are going through. So these are just some of the examples that range from storybooks for kids all the way up to medical intervention that is now no longer available to trans people in the same way as it was. The States is particularly bad, and rolling back rather than kind of moving forward, but it has impacts elsewhere too.
It is horrendous what's going on.
And that's why they call it life-saving intervention, of medical intervention, because the support that trans people can get when they are properly supported is life-saving, both in terms of medication, in terms of therapies, in terms of just having a community around them to help with that transition and understand that transition. So that's exactly why they refer to it as life-saving.
Yeah, it's horrendous. And I see in the last 20 years or so, even clothing for children has become so polarized, with pink fluffy things for girls, princesses and unicorns, dinosaurs and pirates for boys. It drove me mad when I had my first child 16 years ago, and I was finding unisex clothes in just a couple of shops that had like rainbows and yellow and lovely colors. And then I was passing them on from one child to the other. But it feels like the polarization starts at like pre-birth with these gender reveal parties. And it's like you're going to fit into this category and do or die. And I see, like, back when I was a child, when I look back at the photos, I was in navy overalls and red and white striped things. And I don't think in the 70s and 80s there was such a polarization, color-wise even, of gender. But it seems like it's become even more binary now, and it makes everything so much harder when a child is growing up trying to figure out who they are. It's just like, why are we so quick to put people into boxes,
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing, and it's, these things are really, really complex. And
Yeah.
all we need to do, like literally all we need to do, is leave space for conversations.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all we need to do. And as soon as you start taking those spaces away from other people in which they might be able to discuss themselves, their identity, their identity journeys, by the way, because I don't necessarily think that these things are destinations a lot of the time. It's not a final place that you reach that you go, oh well, that's me done now. I've got that sorted out. But even think about it, I'm 40 now, and when I came out when I was 19, I came out as gay. But now more than often I would describe myself as queer, I suppose. But I mean, it also doesn't really matter that much to me. And I think if I was coming out now, I probably wouldn't come out at all. I'd just turn up with whoever I turned up with. Do you know what I mean? I mean, in my case, it would be a man every time. But I'm just saying, these aren't finite things. They're not finished things. It's all part of an evolution. It's all part of an individual's look. All any of us are trying to do is get from the beginning to the end in as meaningful and as joyful a way as we possibly can. And we share that with everybody. And so then when we start intervening in other people's journeys, that's when I think it becomes problematic.
And I'm going to blame the school system and industrialization for a lot of it, because if you've got 33 children in a classroom and you want them all to wear the same clothes, you're going to have issues, because there will be a few kids there who don't want to wear the trousers or the skirt assigned to their gender. So I think it starts right back then, when children are feeling like they can't express themselves, or they can't grow their hair. If they're male in a boys' school, they're made cut it short. And these things still go on, and parents still accept it, and nobody's fighting the system. And I think it's just insidious. It's like, I saw your post yesterday about the Catholic Church, and maybe we won't go there because we want our blood pressure to stay calm and low. But there's so much, what's the word, conditioning in our society that we've just accepted. How do we bring about a change where people are more accepted and feeling supported to be themselves? Where does it start? Does it start at a bigger level with the government and schools, or does it start in the home with parents?
I think it starts in the home with parents, sadly, because I don't want to have to give parents more to do. Change is a difficult thing, right? Because as soon as change is implemented, we change ourselves again and we morph. And so then change needs to keep changing. So again, it's this thing of not it's this thing of not trying to look at it as a finite destination, that once we get to there, we're done, because we'll never get there and we'll never be done. What it would take is for people not to be minorities in whatever way, and that's just never going to happen. So therefore we will never, and I don't mean to sound downbeat about it. I don't, I'm very hopeful and I'm very joyful about what queer existence, queer relationships and queer identities are, particularly in this moment in time. There is in many ways never been a better time to be queer, because our lives, depending on where you live, our lives are not in danger in the same way as they were 150 years ago. But nonetheless, a minority is a minority, and will always have to deal with that minority status in different ways. I think it's something though about not being interested in ideas of tolerance, or interested in ideas of like to oppose somebody else's existence, regardless of what it is just kind of weird. Do you know what I mean? It's just a little bit like, why are you so obsessed with me or them or whoever it is? Like, be a little bit less upset. Like, it's creepy. Just don't get involved. So I think it's important for us to, as queer people, to get on with our lives and excel and be brilliant and be whatever we can be, the whole plethora of humanity. But sometimes it's not that easy to do that, particularly if you feel like your life is in danger, or particularly when you feel like I think people will never be able to understand, unless you're queer, of course, you'll never be able to understand what it is like to not feel fully comfortable holding your partner's hand, your husband's hand, your wife's hand, whatever it is, walking down a street. Like, I cannot do that. And I know I physically can. I know I can physically make that decision to do it myself. But the levels of uncomfortability, and it's an age thing, I'm sure 20-year-olds don't necessarily feel the same as I do, and that's a brilliant thing, and I'm really glad that that's progressing. But sometimes it's that thing of going, God, there's constantly fights, isn't there? And Panty summed it up really well a few years back. Like, there's just constant little battles that we have with ourselves, let alone with anybody else. But of course, those battles are conditioned into us. They're not coming from nowhere.
Yeah. I still don't see enough gay couples holding hands on the streets of Dublin. I know there are some streets that feel safer than others, and you'll see them there. And they usually tend to be around the gay bars and the more affluent areas. But then there are some areas where I just know, if I was walking along here with my same-sex partner, I would not be here. Actually, I wouldn't even step on this street. You know, you just get a feeling some areas are safer than others in all respects. And that makes me really sad. But then it makes me really sad how the city centre is unsafe for so many people, not just people in same-sex relationships or trans people. So I don't know. I think, yeah, it has to start with the home. I think parents need to feel secure enough to embrace change, whatever that may look like. And if I think they need to listen to their children. If their children are saying, I want to cut my hair, or I don't want to wear the school skirt, I want to wear the trousers, they need to go with that and advocate for their child. And that's how we might see a bit of a shift go on. Because children, you know, are not just making it up, and they're not just trying to fit in with the crowd, and they're not just, you know, being influenced by their peers. I do think these are genuine wishes and wants that the kids have going on. You know, it's not just a trend or a fad. You do hear that sometimes.
Oh yeah, all the time. And I mean, that's one of the things about returning to history, right? Is to show that these experiences have existed all throughout history. And then you get the pushback of going, yes, but not at this level. We're seeing it at just, you know, it's ridiculous levels that's happening now. I'm like, well, what you're seeing happening is that people have the language with which to express what they're experiencing now. And they didn't necessarily have that before. Now, that didn't stop some people from exploring. There's a brilliant historian called Jen Mannion, and Jen describes people in the 18th century as transing, but using the word trans as a verb. So not necessarily an identity marker, again, like we have it today, but just an action that is done. So you get loads of examples of that in there. But in Jen's book, they have tens of examples of what they call female husbands, and it's an incredible book. The book is called Female Husbands. I highly recommend it to anybody. It's so fascinating and so well written. But you know, there is a history here, and maybe that's one of the ways forward in sharing. I mean, I make no apologies for the history that I find when I find it in the archive, queer and all as it might be. Like it's there. Like it's not up for debate. You don't get to debate that. And it's one of the things that I sympathize so strongly with the trans community specifically about, because their very existence is being debated openly on mainstream media, on social media, on whatever it is. And I remember how, despite the positive outcome, how damaging it was to hear your relationships and the validity of your relationships being debated during the same-sex marriage referendum in Ireland. And to hear whether or not people thought that our relationships are valid, it's no matter what way you look at it, was damaging despite the outcome.
It's horrendous.
And that's what I think is the worst thing that's happening to trans people at the moment as well, even in places that are not legislating against trans people, is just having this constant debate as to the validity of their, it's none of your business. Off you go, have a lovely time, go and get a cup of tea, have a scone, you're grand. You don't need to get involved in this person's life. Like, you know, it's weird. Again, it's weird.
Yeah. I even found the debates about same-sex marriage and the whole idea of polling the country. Do you think these people deserve to marry each other? That was so wrong on every level. It should have just been put into law. Like, why did we have to vote? That was like a popularity contest. And the effects of that are still being seen. We still remember the counties that voted no. You know, I just thought that was so anti-human. That was horrendous. That whole time was supremely triggering. So I'm hoping, I hope it's kind of like the autism and ADHD thing where people say, oh, how come everyone's getting diagnosed now? I hope it's that people feel safer to embrace their identity and to be public about it. People have always known they're trans. People have always felt different. And now we know that it's because we're on the spectrum and we have the words and language to describe what we are and how we show up in the world. It seems like there's way more of us now. There isn't. We've always been here. We just didn't know what was wrong, you know?
The example I always give is that when people use this language thing, going, well, you know, you can't call somebody this or you can't say that because they didn't understand themselves as this. Well, here's the thing about that. The word family in the 18th century did not mean exactly what it means today when we say family. So the word family was a much broader concept in the 18th century. Yet if you were to talk about the history of the family in the 18th century, nobody would say to you, well, you need to give me the definition of what you mean there. Like, how have you defined that? Because we all understand the term family. Well, we think we do. We all know what that means. Again, we think we do. So nobody ever looks at that terminology. Or for instance, when people talk about heterosexuality in the past, which they do all the time, you're never asked to give a definition where you got your heterosexual definition from, because again, it's seen as the default, it's seen as the natural point. But the idea of heterosexuality wasn't invented, and I use that word deliberately, until after the idea of homosexuality. So, but again, that's never queried in the same way. So, and I'm sure it's the same with neurodivergence, in that you're not playing on an even playing field. So it's also about trying to level that field whenever we as individuals have an opportunity to do that, and kind of mow our message through a little bit, where it's going, this was here, this existed, here's the proof, in the case of historic queerness, and allowing that to hopefully inform, I don't have control over this, but allowing that to hopefully inform the contemporary conversations we're having today.
Absolutely. So what was defined as a family back in the 18th century?
So there was a few different strands, actually. So we have the idea of the lineage family, which are basically your ancestors, your blood kin. But the most everyday definition of the family included your house servants, for instance. So you would be looking after your family, but that could include Mary down the road, who lives in the upper bedroom and is no blood relation. You pay her to be there, or in some cases you don't. But she is included as part of your family. That was part of the definition. In cases in the South of America, there is the idea of our family, black and white. So this was used to bolster enslavement and the enslavement of African people. So the institution of family is often used to shore up these ideas of control. And we get it an awful lot even today, when we're like, well, these are against family values. And I'm like, well, whose family and whose values?
Yeah, huge. So it feels like the Georgian period was way more enlightened in so many ways. And it feels like, obviously, we know the Victorians were so repressed. And do you think we're coming back? Are we in an age of enlightenment now? Or do you think we're still quite, stuck in our little boxes and causing trouble for each other?
I suppose it's never that black and white. I mean, the 18th century, the Georgian period, is known as the Enlightenment. That they called it that at the time. So they felt that they were educating themselves. They felt that they were progressive and moving forward and making all of these incredible discoveries, which they were. But at the same time, as I said at the outset, the transatlantic slave trade is happening in the back of all of this, and that's certainly not the most enlightened thing that's happening at any point in history. In terms of what happens in the Victorian era, yeah, there's a general, I would say, regulation rather than repression, because actually the sex life of the Victorians, is a historian called Kate Lister. She presents another podcast on History Hit called Betwixt the Sheets, and read her book, because the Victorians were not repressed. They were far from it, but actually it was less open potentially than it was in the Georgian period. Now, to come back to the question you asked, I do have a theory that we are in a more Georgian-like, nothing's ever exactly the same in the past, but we're in a more Georgian-like moment. And my fear is that we transition into a more Victorian-like moment in the future. And there are patterns coming here, the pushback against some of these ideas of sex, gender, and sexuality. The housing crisis, where in the Victorian period there was huge multiple occupancy, and you're seeing some of that come through here. There are wars that are unfolding that would feed into some of the wars, that draw some parallels between some of the 19th century wars. So the history doesn't repeat itself, but there are patterns that sometimes emerge. And I think we're at a moment of crisis in a way now, where we get to decide. And it feels to me Ireland particularly is hopefully deciding a good route to go. No country is perfect with this, but overall, Ireland to me feels like it's slowly but surely going in the right direction. I was worried about the UK, and as you say, like I live there, I live between Ireland and the UK, but I lived there a lot of the time. And I was worried about where that was going. A little bit of hope more recently after the general election, but who knows? I think it's still all to play for. What happens with emigration there, or immigration more specifically, will determine how that pans out. But yeah, I think we're at a silent moment of crisis in terms of how we determine what we're going to be. America's at that point right now as well. So, you know, Western world is at an interesting point.
It is. It kind of feels a bit like we're in Hobbiton, you know, and everything around us is at war and it's crazy, but we're this safe little space in many ways. I know it's not perfect, but it does feel like, you know, we're in the best place. I know I wouldn't want to live anywhere else in terms of human rights for my children. But I know that hasn't always been the case for some of my same-sex
Yeah.
friends and family members. They've wanted to move. If the referendum was going to go the wrong way, they would have moved. And Spain was looking like a good place. Northern Spain, there are some safe areas for same-sex couples. So it's very tricky, but I do think it comes back down to the micro level of families and households and parents educating their children in the home about diversity and inclusion, and not leaving it up to school to teach your kids about sexuality or anything else. I do think you have to take that into your own hands and not be afraid of it. Educate yourself first so you can pass it on.
And I think people, generally speaking, are decent. People want to be good. They try to be good people. I think they try to be respectful mostly, or at least I hope they do. And it's all just an extension of that. But I will say this, one thing that I've noticed, especially since I've been home a little bit more recently, is that the generation kind of above us who might go, oh, I'm too old for this, I can't keep up with this at all, this is too, we never had any of this. And it just makes me so determined not to stop learning as I get older, and not to go, again, it's not this, knowledge is not a finite thing, going, well, I'm 70 now and I refuse to learn anything else, you know. And that's not exclusive to all 70-year-olds. Let me just point that out. But like, it is, I've heard that quite a few times, going, I can't keep up with this, this is madness, Nash. Listen, I respect everybody, but I don't know. But you just learn then. If you don't know, learn. It's
I
fine.
was
It's
actually
up to
very
you.
heartened when the same-sex marriage referendum came in. I was heartened by how so many of that generation voted yes, because
Yeah.
you know, just scratching the surface with them, they wanted the same rights for everyone, and they had seen firsthand all the issues. You know, it was 93 or 95 that we decriminalized homosexuality in Ireland. Which was it?
I think 93, I think.
Yeah, I was 15. So they've seen that. They've seen the repression. They've seen the church at its worst in the 60s. So I think they know this time is up. You know, we're moving into a new era. So obviously, you know, some of them will still have their heads in the sand, but yeah, knowledge is not finite. We still grow and develop, and we can learn right up to the day we die. That's so important to remember.
And that's so interesting what you say about we're moving into a new Ireland. I do think we are. I think there's something really interesting that's happened around the 100-year anniversary of our independence from Britain, or a partial independence from Britain. And that, I hope, makes us look at who we are as opposed to who we're not, i.e. British. So I often find that for the last 100 years, we've put an awful lot of, and this is totally understandable, this isn't a criticism, it's just an observation of going, we've put an awful lot of effort into establishing who we're not. We are not British, so we don't do this. This is what we do. But actually, what I think we're finding now, and I think it's what you're describing about, it feels like a safe place to be, generally speaking, is I think we're really discovering who we are as opposed to who we're not. And I think that's important.
I think we're, on the whole, I think we're very welcoming towards immigrants as well. We're very hospitable. You know, I'm seeing that on a small level. We spend our summers down in Wexford, and I'm seeing the Ukrainian families being integrated into the communities. They're joining the knitting clubs. You know, there's so much warmth and welcome in our smaller towns and villages, which is brilliant, because when you read the newspaper, you'd be led to believe otherwise. And I'm really regretful that that small minority of very right-wing, closed-minded people are getting so much attention, because I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's a true representation of our Irish, what's the word? Nature, you know?
And experience.
Yeah, we were the ones treated badly in previous centuries, and I think we know what it's like to be the underdog and to be sent in the back door. So I think we are very open and welcoming on the whole towards other people. So it does give me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think Ireland feels hopeful, right? And it hasn't always.
Yeah.
I mean, when even in 2006 or 7, whenever it was when I left, I didn't feel like I had to go, but I didn't even consider staying. I was like, I'm off.
Yeah.
But there's something changed. Listen, this is very, I suppose, personal to me, just because given my circumstances, but something did feel like it changed with the marriage referendum, despite how horrendous some of that conversation was. But that change seemed to go, oh, this is who we could be. There was something exciting about the result, I think.
Yeah.
And people liked what they saw there. And it was something that and also we have a great president. Like, he's just the most amazing man. Like, he's just incredible. And I know, like, he's not a politician in the usual sense of the word, in terms of one of our TDs or the Taoiseach or whatever, but to have someone who's so learned and so articulate and so passionate as our head of state is a real blessing as well, I think.
It really is. Yeah. So can we wrap up, Anthony? I don't want to take too long, but I have a few questions I finish with for everybody, just to get to know you a little better. And people, where can they find you firstly? Because your work is fascinating. I definitely have to have you back on to discuss more of the same, because I want to go deeper into everything we've talked about today. So where can people follow your work online?
Well, they can find me at Anthony Delaney History on Instagram and on, what's the other one? TikTok, yes. And then they will be able to listen to my podcast, which I co-host with Maddie Pelling on the History Hit Network, which is called After Dark. And that's all about the darker side of history. So we look at true crimes, we look at monsters and myths and ghosts and hauntings, and look at the real history behind some of those phenomena.
It's fascinating. And I'm dying to read your book when it comes out next year. What's it called?
So it's going to be called Queer Georgians. If you're in the UK or Ireland or Europe, it's called Queer Georgians. If you're in the US, it's going to be called Queer Enlightenment.
Oh, okay. Very good. What's the reason for the title change over there?
Georgians to them are people who live in the state of Georgia.
Oh,
so they're like, why are you writing a history book about this one specific state, which I'm not? So that's why it had to be changed.
Fair enough. Okay, that's going to be amazing. Okay, so here are the final questions. Was there a book or movie that made a big impression on you growing up?
Oh,
I've got my one right here, actually. I haven't shared this yet on the podcast. This was probably my favorite. And it's actually a really Alice in Wonderland. This is the exact copy I got, and the first time I discovered the story was from this book. I think it was printed in 1985, and this is delving deeper into the whole psychology of this book. Alice in Wonderland is actually one of the fictional characters that autistic girls identify with most, because of her feeling strange in a world where nothing makes sense to you. And it's just amazing on so many levels that is the book that was always my biggest influence.
Oh, she's falling off the side now.
Down the rabbit hole.
She's gone. For me, I think it always I struggle with these things when it's like, oh, name one thing, because I'm like, I want to name 458 different things that have all come together. But
top five, I'm easy.
The one thing that always sticks out with this in terms of books is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. It is the only book that has ever made me cry to this day. And I read that when I was a kid, and well, I was probably a teen. I was probably in my early teens at that point. And yeah, as I say, it's the only book that has ever made me cry to this day. And it was the idea that people could be so cruel. Celia is just treated so awfully throughout, and it's, well, not quite throughout, but for most of the book. And there was something about cruelty that is a very human thing and a very everyday thing. Sometimes when we hear about these big, awful things that happen, we can't really identify, because you're like, well, I don't have a frame of reference for that. But cruelty, we have a frame of reference for. We can be cruel. And it's very much within our capability to replicate some of the cruelty that's in there. And that was the most kind of shocking thing for me. I think I was 13 when I read it. But yeah, so The Color Purple still holds a very dear place in my heart, I think.
Oh, wow. What did you think of the film adaptation?
I really liked it. I cried at that too. And I don't cry very often, but I did cry at that.
Sometimes the films don't live up to the book, so that's good that you like that as well.
Yeah, no, I did.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Couple more. What is your favorite meal, if you could choose one?
Okay, everybody makes fun. This is easier. Everyone makes fun of me for this because it's really basic, but I will do anything for a pizza. A good pizza.
No? Yes, you're the first one who's ever said that on my pod in 15 episodes. Yeah, I'm a pizza.
Has everybody else said really highfalutin posh stuff? They have, haven't they?
salmon with broccoli and sweet potatoes. Go away. No way. Give me pizza.
I just want a pizza. Yeah, I just want a pizza. And actually, I love, and I'm not being sponsored by them, but I love a Domino's Texas barbecue pizza. It's not posh. It's not, Michelin starred, but oh my God, that is a delicious piece of food for me. Now, people will come for me for that, but I don't care.
I
It's
don't
what I
care.
like.
I'm not a food snob at all. I'm very happy. There's never such thing as a bad pizza. Even the worst of the pizza is still okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so true, actually. I mean, yeah, even mediocre pizzas is just like, it's not the best, but it's still a pizza. I still enjoy myself.
Same with cake. I've never had a bad slice of cake. Cake is cake.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a motto for life? And if so, what is it? Something you live by?
Um, I don't necessarily have a, like, this isn't written down anywhere.
Yeah.
But the thing that I've always had to do, and this is, from acting and in history, whatever, is just go again, go again, go again, go again. Just go again. Like, go again. I don't have to explain it anymore. It's just like, right, that was crap. Let's go again. It's you can do over. You can go again.
Yeah, I love that. That's so positive and hopeful. And you're not looking for perfection. You just keep trying and trying.
Oh God, don't no, no, my God. I spent too long looking for perfection. No, just go
Yeah.
again and keep trying.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm hearing that in a load of people who I ask these questions to. They're all saying, I've let go of perfection. It sounds like a shift that we all decided to make in the last few years in our lives. I know I did for sure. I realized
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
holding me
yeah.
back and procrastination was killing my creativity. So yeah, I'm okay with imperfection now.
Absolutely. It's part of the process. There is no destination.
Yeah. Okay. And finally, what's your idea of perfect happiness, if it exists at all?
Um, Again, probably a journey, but I actually do have an answer to this because I remember walking through Greenwich maybe about 10 years ago. Maybe it could have been a little bit more. So Greenwich is where I live when I'm in London. And there was, this is really silly probably, but I remember thinking it at the time. So I'll tell you, which was, I walked past this person's house and it was nighttime, or it was a winter evening. His room looked really warm and cozy and nicely decorated. I am gay after all. I don't want to be living in any old hovel. And he was reading a book. There was a newspaper beside him on a little table by the chair. He was sitting in a comfortable chair. There was a glass of wine, red wine specifically. I don't drink red wine, but just as the image, that's what he had. And I remember thinking to myself, he looks so content. Like and for me, that suddenly became, in X amount of years, I don't know what age he was, but he was well into his 70s, 80s, if not more, I'd say. I remember going, that's where I need to get to. I need to be sitting down. I don't know what that man was going through that evening, but to me, as I passed by outside, probably having come home from a bar shift or something at the time, I remember thinking, that looks like it's a pretty decent deal. I'll go for that.
Oh, that's gorgeous. And have you achieved that for yourself any times? Have you ever sat and
Oh,
thought, this is it now? I'm in this moment that I wanted.
Oh, I'm quite bad about being in moments. I am. That's not something I excel at. I have to say, I'm not like, right, next thing. You know that thing where it's like, keep going, like go again. I'm always going again, even in a negative way. So, but yeah, there's been a couple of times. There's I was on the coast in a place called oh God, what the hell is it called? It's in Scotland. Anyway, I was up on the Scottish coast and we were looking at dolphins at one point, and I was standing in a ruin and I went to myself, God, I'm not sure it gets much better than this for that moment in time. I have it an awful lot as well. Sometimes if I'm waiting for a director to say action, I'm like, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe I get to do this. And then when I have meetings now, when I have meetings with like my podcast team or with the book team, I'm like, how is this happening? How, like, this is ridiculous. Like this. So I get moments of those, but I'm not quite in my comfy chair in my nicely lit, nicely heated room just yet. But listen, it's all part of the process. It'll come.
It will, of course. And you're still young and exploring the world. So I'm sure he had his time running around going again, and then he's settling down now into his old later years. So you'll get there,
Into
but
his
don't rush
dotage.
for that either. But you are enjoying
No, no.
sounds like. So that's good. Because I was going to give you
Yeah,
some
yeah.
mindfulness tips, but it sounds like you know how to stop and say, I'm here now. This is a good moment. And that's all it ever is. It's just a moment. And then something happens, something curveball comes in and we're pulled out of it again. But as
We're
long as
gone again. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's brilliant. Anthony, I could talk to you all day. You're just fascinating. You're charming. You're learned. You're wonderful. Thank you so
Oh,
much for
God.
being a guest on my podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go to my dentist now and get my Invisalign off to see how many more weeks I have to wear them. So I have a very glamorous afternoon ahead of myself.
Well, good luck with it.
Thank you so much, Niamh. It's been absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you. I loved it. Take care. See you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I could have talked to Anthony for another hour. He is fascinating and taught me so much. I can't wait to read his book when it's published next year. Guys, I just want to thank you for the support. The podcast downloads are skyrocketing. You're obviously loving the diversity of my guests, and I'm really loving putting them together for you. My corporate workload at the Wellness Clinic is heavier now the summer's over, but I will still endeavour to get one episode out every Tuesday. And if you've any ideas for future guests, please let me know. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next week.